I saw you push her, Mrs. Garcia, screamed a trembling voice as my 78-year-old grandmother, Judge Maria Lopez, lay crumpled on the ground beneath her balcony, blood seeping from her temple. Above, HOA President Linda still clutched the broken balcony spindle in one hand, her expression a mix of feigned shock and cold calculation that didn't match the scene below. It was a moment that froze time. In that instant, the chaos of a routine fence dispute exploded into a spectacle of injustice, a spectacle that would soon rock our quiet community to its core. For years, my grandmother, a former Supreme Court judge with a mind as sharp as a tack, had carried herself with dignity and strength despite the petty tyrannies of our neighborhood's overbearing HOA. But now, as I watched her battered form on the cold pavement, it was clear that the rules had been weaponized and the enforcer had overstepped all bounds. I could hardly believe my eyes. The very person entrusted with upholding our community's standards, Linda, with her unyielding adherence to trivial regulations, had physically pushed my grandmother during a dispute over a poorly placed fence. The incident was captured by hidden security cameras and would soon spread like wildfire. As the last glimmers of twilight faded, the painful image of Judge Maria Lopez, once a pillar of justice and decency, lying helpless on the ground, was seared into my mind. This was not merely a misunderstanding or a clash of temperaments. It was a blatant abuse of power that demanded accountability. I knew then that something had to be done. My grandmother's decades of service to justice could not be overshadowed by the arrogance of one individual. The HOA's grip on our lives had gone too far, and Linda's actions were the last straw. Tonight, as I stared at the fading embers of that horrific scene, I vowed that the community would no longer accept this abuse. My resolve hardened like the winter frost, and I promised that every penny, every ounce of dignity stolen from my family would be reclaimed, and that the very person behind it would soon pay a heavy price. Cedar Grove Estates was meant to be a model of suburban perfection, a pristine gated community where every lawn was manicured, every house painted in soft, uniform hues, and every resident adhered strictly to a lengthy list of community rules. The Homeowners Association, HOA, ruled with an iron fist, ensuring that no one dared deviate from the prescribed order. At the very heart of this operation was Linda Miller, the HOA president, known to all as HOA Linda. In her early 50s and always impeccably dressed in a sharply tailored suit, Linda wielded her clipboard and smartphone like weapons, patrolling the neighborhood with a hawk-like vigilance. To her, even the slightest infraction, a stray decoration or an off-color lawn ornament, was an affront to the community's sacred order. In stark contrast, my family's estate, which had been in our bloodline for generations, was a testament to hard work, tradition, and a fierce belief in individual freedom. Nestled on the outskirts of Cedar Grove, our property boasted a sprawling farmhouse, acres of untamed fields, and a warm, welcoming atmosphere that celebrated life's natural unpredictability. It was here that my beloved grandmother, Judge Maria Lopez, had lived for decades. Once a respected Supreme Court judge, she carried herself with quiet dignity and a razor-sharp mind. Even after retiring, she remained a pillar of strength and justice, her advice sought after by all who knew her. Our farm stand was more than just a business. It was an expression of our heritage and a celebration of the bounty our land offered. Every season, we filled it with fresh produce, homemade preserves, and artisanal crafts, a small, thriving market that was the pride of our family. It stood as a beacon of individuality amid a community that prized uniformity. But our way of life had increasingly drawn the ire of the HOA. Over the years, Linda had fined us for minor infractions, for a sign that was deemed too colorful, for decorative elements that clashed with the community's drab aesthetic, and for any hint of personal expression that defied the strict guidelines imposed on every resident. The final straw came when Linda, in a fit of bureaucratic zeal, banned our farm stand altogether, declaring it a violation of the community's standards. The decision was made without consultation, and it sent shockwaves through our family. How could they dictate what we could or could not display on our own property? For my grandmother, who had spent a lifetime upholding justice, the punishment was particularly galling. Her wisdom and her storied career were overshadowed by the pettiness of an HOA determined to enforce conformity at all costs. Cedar Grove Estates, with its uniform homes and carefully regulated gardens, was a place where individuality was often suppressed. While many residents grudgingly accepted the HOA's stringent rules, there was a growing undercurrent of dissent, quiet murmurs of discontent, and a longing for the freedom to express oneself. My family, with its rich history and unabashed individuality, had become a symbol of that resistance. And when Linda's latest decree threatened to silence our farm stand, it wasn't just a personal insult. It was a challenge to the very values of justice and freedom that my grandmother embodied. As I prepared to confront this injustice, I knew that the battle ahead would be more than a fight for a market stall. It would be a stand for our right to live authentically, to celebrate our heritage, and to defy the oppressive forces of conformity. With my grandmother's strength echoing in my heart and the support of neighbors who had grown weary of the HOA's overreach, I set my resolve. Linda Miller and her petty enforcement would soon learn that in Cedar Grove, the spirit of freedom could never be tamed. The tension had been mounting for months. Every time we set up our farm stand, Linda would show up unannounced, clipboard in hand, issuing fines for unauthorized artistic expression and other such flimsy charges. The fines, initially dismissed as minor inconveniences, had grown in number and severity. Neighbors whispered about our defiance and the courage it took to stand against the relentless enforcement of uniformity. It wasn't long before the community began to sympathize with our plight, a small voice in a sea of conformity. Then came the fateful day when an incident escalated beyond all previous transgressions. It began as a routine afternoon. Customers milled about our stand, admiring the fresh produce and homemade goods, when an argument erupted over a disputed fence line between our property and an adjacent lot. Tempers flared, and amid the shouting, Linda arrived, more determined than ever to assert her authority. In the midst of the dispute, she ordered her enforcers to intervene, and before anyone could comprehend what was happening, she physically shoved my grandmother, Mrs. Lopez, off a balcony during a tense exchange over the fence's proper alignment. The scene was horrifying. I heard a guttural scream echo through the air as my 78-year-old grandmother tumbled down, her body crumpling upon impact, blood seeping from her temple. I stood frozen, stunned by the brutality of it all, as Linda, with a look that oscillated between feigned shock and cold calculation, clutched a broken piece of the balcony's railing as if it were a trophy. The outburst was captured on multiple security cameras and spread rapidly throughout the community. It wasn't long before neighbors were sharing the footage online, their outrage palpable and their calls for justice growing louder by the hour. Determined to stand up for my family and to expose Linda's abuse of power, I immediately began compiling every piece of evidence. I gathered security footage, eyewitness accounts, and even medical reports detailing my grandmother's injuries. Each document painted a clear picture. Linda's actions were not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a deliberate, excessive use of force aimed at silencing dissent and enforcing conformity. I presented my evidence to the HOA board, demanding a thorough investigation and immediate disciplinary action against Linda. However, as expected, the board, long under the influence of Linda's unchallenged authority, initially brushed aside my claims as isolated incidents blown out of proportion. But as the digital evidence continued to spread and the public outcry swelled, it became impossible for the board to ignore the mounting pressure. In secret, I began to rally support among neighbors. I reached out to those who had suffered under arbitrary fines, and together we formed a coalition dedicated to fighting for our rights. We organized informal gatherings, shared our stories on community forums, and even started a petition demanding reforms within the HOA. The petition, titled Justice for Our Homes, quickly amassed thousands of signatures. It was a call to action, a declaration that no one, not even the president of the HOA, was above accountability. As the days passed, the conflict grew increasingly personal. I received messages from sympathetic neighbors and even from local media, all urging the board to take swift action. The digital dossier I had assembled became a powerful weapon, a testament to the truth of what had happened and a challenge to the oppressive system that had long silenced voices like mine. I knew that if Linda thought she could intimidate us with her fines and her rigid enforcement, she was in for a rude awakening. The time had come to expose her for what she was, a bully masquerading as an enforcer of order. Late one evening, as I reviewed the final details of our petition and prepared for the upcoming public hearing, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of resolve. The community's support was a tidal wave of righteous indignation, and every piece of evidence, every shared video clip, was a clarion call for change. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about reclaiming our right to live freely, to express ourselves without fear, and to stand up against those who would impose their personal vendettas on us. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown. The HOA board had announced a final public hearing to address the incident and to decide the fate of Linda Miller's authority. It was clear that the coming days would determine not only my family's future, but the future of Cedar Grove's very identity. And as I gather my evidence one last time, I knew that this battle was far from over. It was just the beginning of a revolution for justice and individual freedom in our community. In the aftermath of the violent incident, Cedar Grove became a hotbed of dissent. Social media platforms exploded with shared videos of the incident, and hashtags like hashtag Justice for Grandma, hashtag No More HOA bullying, and hashtag Stand for Freedom began trending locally. Neighbors, long silenced by fear of arbitrary fines, now found their voices united in a resounding call for accountability. Every post, every comment, was a declaration that our community would no longer tolerate abuse of power by an overzealous enforcer. Local news stations soon picked up the story. Reporters arrived on the scene and interviewed shocked residents who recounted the horrifying moment they witnessed my grandmother fall. "I couldn't believe what I saw," one neighbor recalled tearfully. "My own grandmother, a former Supreme Court judge, reduced to a victim of petty bullying. This is unacceptable." The media coverage not only spread the word but also shone a harsh light on the systemic issues within the HOA. Inside the HOA board, tensions reached a fever pitch. Emergency meetings were held in cramped conference rooms, where board members debated the legitimacy of Linda's actions. Leaked minutes revealed deep divisions. While some staunch supporters of strict rule enforcement argued that the rules must be upheld no matter what, others acknowledged that Linda's actions had crossed a moral line. "We have allowed personal vendettas to become the norm," one board member was quoted as saying. The internal rift threatened to splinter the board, and as public pressure mounted, it became clear that decisive action was inevitable. I continued to update my digital dossier, posting live updates from community forums and sharing high-quality clips of the incident along with testimonies from other residents who had experienced similar abuses. Online petitions demanding a full disciplinary review and reforms within the HOA grew by the hour, amassing tens of thousands of signatures. The momentum was unstoppable, a grassroots movement fueled by years of pent-up frustration and the undeniable evidence of abuse. Influential bloggers and community activists began to publicly support the cause, calling for an overhaul of the HOA's practices and for accountability for Linda's actions. Meanwhile, Linda Miller's attempts to defend her actions crumbled under scrutiny. In a series of hastily recorded videos posted on social media, she claimed that she was maintaining order and upholding community standards. But every assertion was swiftly dismantled by the evidence. Her voice, once authoritative, now trembled with desperation as digital proof of her indiscretions circulated widely. The community's collective outrage reached a boiling point, and it was clear that this issue was no longer just about fines. It was about the fundamental rights of residents to live freely and without arbitrary interference. The final public hearing was announced with great fanfare, a last chance for the HOA board to address the crisis and determine the future of community governance in Cedar Grove. In the days leading up to the hearing, neighbors organized protests and meetings, distributing flyers that read "Our homes, our rights, and justice for every resident." The digital petition was shared relentlessly, and every comment on social media echoed the same message. If the board did not act, then the legacy of arbitrary rule enforcement would continue unchecked. On the morning of the final hearing, the community center was packed with a sea of determined residents. Every face in the crowd reflected a mix of anger, sorrow, and unwavering resolve. My digital dossier was displayed prominently on large screens, and the atmosphere was charged with the promise of change. The narrative was clear. Linda Miller's abuse of power had to end, and the HOA board had no choice but to restore trust in their governance. As I took my seat among the crowd, I could sense that this moment would be a turning point, not only for my family but for every resident in Cedar Grove. The tension was palpable, and the collective energy was like a living force, ready to sweep away years of oppressive enforcement. It was a battle for the soul of our community, a fight to reclaim our rights, and our freedom to express ourselves without fear of retribution. The decisive moment arrived on a brisk, clear morning in the packed boardroom at the Cedar Grove Community Center. The room was filled with HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and hundreds of impassioned residents, all gathered for the final public hearing that would determine the future of our community's enforcement policies. With a calm yet unyielding presence, Councilwoman Elena Morales stepped up to the podium, her eyes reflecting the collective determination of a community that had long been oppressed by arbitrary rules. After a comprehensive review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage, detailed logs of complaints, and the heartfelt testimonies of our residents, we have reached an inescapable conclusion. Councilwoman Morales began, her voice steady and resonant. It is abundantly clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Linda Miller, particularly her physical assault on a 78-year-old resident during a fence dispute, were not motivated by any genuine concern for community aesthetics or safety, but by personal bias and a gross abuse of power. Our community's right to live freely and to manage our own property must be upheld, and no one should be allowed to enforce their personal vendettas at the expense of our dignity. A heavy silence settled over the room as Morales continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all sanctions and fines related to these incidents, and we will initiate a full disciplinary review of the policies and practices that permitted such overreach. Furthermore, we will implement new guidelines to safeguard the rights and freedoms of every resident in Cedar Grove. Today's decision is not merely about reversing an isolated incident. It is a resounding declaration that our community will stand for justice, accountability, and the sanctity of private property. Her words resonated powerfully, and murmurs of approval rippled through the assembly. At that moment, a longtime community advocate, a stalwart defender of individual rights, rose to speak. "Today, we stand united," he declared, his voice firm and impassioned. No resident should ever be subjected to the tyranny of arbitrary rule enforcement. Let this vote mark the turning point, a clear signal that Cedar Grove values freedom, creativity, and inviolability of our homes above all. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every violation of our rights is met with swift, decisive action. His declaration was met with thunderous applause, uniting everyone in a resolute call for reform. Following his powerful address, a senior official from the local public safety department presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence, expert testimonies, and official reports that confirmed the legitimacy of our property rights and debunked every claim made by Linda Miller. The evidence was irrefutable. The physical assault, the unauthorized actions, and the cumulative pattern of abuse all pointed to one truth. Our community would no longer be bullied by one overzealous enforcer. The Internal Affairs panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release to ensure transparency. Councilwoman Morales concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Cedar Grove, a community where every resident's rights are respected and where public authority is exercised with fairness and integrity. Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our freedoms and that no one can impose their will on our community without accountability. Together, we stand for justice, transparency, and the inalienable right to live freely on our own property. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our battle for justice and property rights. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of our community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Cedar Grove. The days of petty fines and personal vendettas were over, and a future built on respect for individual rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks following the historic vote, Cedar Grove underwent a profound transformation. News of the rescinded sanctions and the sweeping reforms enacted by the HOA board spread like wildfire through local media and social networks, sparking fervent debates about property rights, community governance, and individual freedom. Editorials in the local newspaper, with headlines such as "A New Dawn for Cedar Grove" and "Community United for Justice," celebrated the decisive actions taken to protect every resident's right to live and work without arbitrary interference. Hashtags like #PropertyRights, #NoMoreHOA, and #CommunityJustice trended widely, reinforcing our collective determination to stand against abuse of power. Town hall meetings and community forums saw record attendance as residents gathered to share their experiences and to envision a future where personal expression and property rights were cherished. Neighbors who had long lived in fear of punitive fines and invasive oversight now spoke openly about their right to manage their own homes and land in ways that reflected their individuality. Our properties are our sanctuaries, and we must defend them at all costs, one impassioned resident declared at a packed meeting, his voice resonating through the room. The atmosphere was one of hope and renewal, a promise that Cedar Grove would always honor the freedoms of its residents. Within the reformed HOA board and local public safety departments, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs on ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint would be meticulously scrutinized and that no resident would ever again be subjected to arbitrary enforcement. Our duty is to protect the rights and dignity of every member of our community, Lieutenant Reed affirmed at a follow-up press conference, reinforcing our renewed commitment to justice and integrity. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations also mobilized to empower residents further. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were organized to raise awareness about property rights and to encourage active participation in shaping a more equitable governance model. When we stand together, our voices become powerful enough to dismantle even the most outdated systems. A local activist proclaimed at a town hall meeting, inspiring residents to unite in the fight for a brighter future. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to stand up against Linda Miller's abuse of power and to fight back for my grandmother's honor had not only reclaimed our family's dignity, but had ignited a movement that resonated throughout Cedar Grove. Neighbors who had long suffered under arbitrary rules found their voices, sharing stories of resistance and rallying for a community where creativity and freedom were celebrated. The digital evidence that exposed the injustice became a beacon of hope, a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of private property and the right to live without fear of bureaucratic tyranny. Linda Miller, once the unchallenged enforcer of Cedar Grove's draconian rules, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one is above accountability when a community unites for justice. Her influence waned rapidly as digital records of her past transgressions circulated widely, underscoring the need for reform and the dangers of unchecked power. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Cedar Grove, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered under the warm glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading "Unity, Freedom, and Property Rights" was unfurled between towering oak trees, and heartfelt speeches echoed with promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate our victory over arbitrary enforcement, a victory for every homeowner and every individual who believes in the right to live freely, Councilwoman Morales proclaimed, her voice ringing with unwavering determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to protecting our freedoms and ensuring that no one can abuse public power again. As each new day dawned over Cedar Grove, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how HOA Linda Miller's oppressive fines and violent enforcement were met with the united resistance of our community became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in justice and creative freedom. Every sunrise now carried the promise that in Cedar Grove, truth, justice, and individual rights would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Grove would forever be a place where creativity, integrity, and respect for individual freedom shone as brightly as the morning light.